God is at work in these really small details. How many kinds of conversations like this do we have all the time? How many conversations do you have with people that you think are absolutely meaningless and pointless, maybe even aggravating? Don't sell those conversations short. Everything matters. God is in control, not us. We know that. I mean, by now, if your diet is blown, it's probably blown, right? If your exercise regimen is blown, it's probably blown, right? Guess what? It doesn't. That's in our lives, but in God's economy, He is in control, and God is the hero of this story. Just the other day, we got Caleb back to Houston, and it really was a very good time together with the Fikes boys. If I could paint this picture for you, it seemed like every night I would walk past Caleb's room, and I would see Caleb and Eli sitting next to each other, just watching stuff on the computer, watching their anime. Just enjoying time with one another. Now this wasn't always that way. There were times when they did boy stuff, and usually boy stuff meant that big brother beat up little brother. Truth be known. But one of the great delights that I have, and I think Pam would say the same, is that our boys truly love each other, and they love each other fiercely. They're nothing like what we read here, thankfully, in the book of Genesis. They, going to the book of Genesis and saying, hey, love your brother like Jacob's kids. No, don't ever say that. Bad idea, because they'll end up in some other country being sold to a bunch of slave traders. But as we look at this passage, why do we need to know this? I think part of it is that we need to know that God, that when things go bad, God will still make something out of it. That's what this passage, and that's indeed what all of Genesis chapters 37 through 50 is teaching us. If you really want to understand what we have before us, you really have to go to Genesis chapter 50, verse 20. So let me encourage you to just flip there real quick, because this is going to be your answer key for understanding the entire passage, all these passages that we're looking at. This is at the very end where they're wondering, oh no, Joseph has gotten powerful. The dreams, they came to pass. What is little brother gonna do? Because little brother has an army. He can have us off and nobody would know. And so they say, hey, what are you going to do with us? And then he says, starting in verse 19, but Joseph said to them, do not fear, for am I in the place of God? As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring it about that many people should be kept alive as they are today. What we are reading here at the beginning of the story is the most unlikely of beginnings. How in the world are you going to rescue the world? Are you going to strip the littlest brother of his clothes, abuse him, throw him into a pit, and sell him into slavery? Is that how you're going to rescue the world? Really? Is that how you're going to do that? If you're going to rescue the world, are you going to send God in the flesh to Bethlehem to be born in a manger so that the world may be saved? It's really that what we're seeing here is the beginning of the gospel. We're starting to see that how God deals with these people who are very, very dysfunctional and who mean evil. This is evil that is taking place here. that brothers are abusing their little brother. They are selling him into slavery. They want to murder him, and they go easy on him and sell him into slavery instead. Okay, that's evil, in case you didn't know. And that's what Joseph says at the end of the story. He says, you meant this for evil. But at the same time, God meant it for good. That God in his sovereignty, in his providence, in his kindness towards you, he's going to do something, he's doing something absolutely amazing that we may not be able to see the blessings that he is pouring into our lives. That's why I'm calling this series Camouflage Blessings, because we can't see it, but we don't have to be able to see it in order for it to be true. We don't have to be able to see what God's doing at the end of all time to know that God loves us, to know that he cares for us, that he will do good for us, and that we have that ultimately in seeing Jesus Christ, in being his. But it doesn't start there. But the big point of all this is that God doesn't let the obstacles get in the way of blessing. Remember at the beginning of the book of Genesis, maybe you don't, but at the beginning of the book of Genesis, everything is chaos. It's out of chaos that God creates the earth. The first day, he creates all these good things. Day 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And then on the seventh day, he looks at it all and he claims it all is very good. He takes things that are bad and somehow, sovereignly, he makes them good. And he does that in creation, but he also does this in the life of a family. That's what he's been doing in the life of Abraham, where he's been saying, it is through you, I'm going to bless you so that you may be a blessing to all the nations of the earth. So that all the nations of the earth may know that I am and that I am a rewarder of those who seek me. So this is part of what God is doing in here, this big picture that he doesn't let obstacles prevent him from blessing because God is in control, not us. We know that, I mean, by now, if your diet is blown, it's probably blown, right? If your exercise regimen is blown, it's probably blown, right? Guess what? It doesn't, that's in our lives. But in God's economy, he is in control. And God is the hero of this story. It's not Joseph. It's not Reuben. It's not, it's definitely not Judah, because Judah's kind of, Judah's, you need to look out for Judah. Judah's vicious. Okay, so all these brothers, they're vicious, but God, he is good and he is loving. And that's what we see here. God is committed to use the dreamer in spite of the ditch in the midst of deception. Those are the 3 Ds that I wanted to focus on this morning. First, let's look at the dreamer in verses 1 through 11. In verses 1 through 11, we're going to see this little punk. His name is Joseph, and he's a bit of a snitch, we think. It's not, the Bible doesn't really come out and say, and that was a bad, very, very bad thing that Joseph did here. That might be us supplying it, right? So let's be honest about that. But it does, if we read between the lines, it seems like he's a bit of a snitch. You know, in verse 2b, it says that Joseph, being 17 years old, he was pasturing the flock with his brothers. He was a boy with the sons of Bilhah and Zilpah, his father's wives, and Joseph brought a bad report of them to their father. Is that a bit of a snitch? Well, maybe. What if they deserved it? Can we ask that question? What if they deserved? What if he wasn't being a snitch? The Bible doesn't really tell us. But it does tell us that he's a dreamer. And throughout this section of the book of Genesis, dreams are going to be very important. They're going to propel the story along. There's going to be 3 series of dreams that we'll find. We'll find Joseph's dreams here. We'll see the dreams of 2 men in prison, and then we'll see the dreams of Pharaoh later on. And always, in each one of these sections of dreams, they always come in 2s. I want you to notice that, because there's 2 sets of dreams here. This is making sure that God is letting us know that this is absolutely assured that this is going to take place. You know, you're going to become a ruler. One of you is going to live who is in this prison, and one of you is going to be hung. And surely there's going to be a famine that's going to take place at the end of this 7 years. And so you better make sure that you have some provisions set up for it. That's a big picture of what's going on over the next 20 or so years in the history of this story. But here, within this small little set in verses 5 through 11, we're seeing that there's two different dreams. Dream number one is the bowing the bowing of the 10 sheaves to his sheaf. It's one of these agricultural kind of images. Joseph says, hey, I had this dream. We were binding sheaves in the field, and behold, my sheaf arose, and yours bowed down to me. And his brothers liked that a lot, right? They said, this is really cool. No. They said, we don't like you anyway. Why do we not like you? Because you have that special robe. Now, that robe might not be a robe of many colors. That phrase in Hebrew is very, very hard to translate. And so it's nobody's fault. It's really hard. It might mean that he has long sleeves, that his robe has long sleeves. It might mean something else. Excuse me for a second. My notes are down here. And it's not going to affect the way the sermon comes out, but it affects the way that I'll feel about the sermon. So when you're looking at this, don't think of Joseph in the Technicolor Dreamcoat kind of thing. It might actually mean that they were long sleeves. It was the best that I can tell is this isn't a working man's coat. This is a fancy boy's coat. That's really what this is. This is a mama's boy, daddy's boy. Daddy's boy of his old age. And so he is definitely letting people know who is the favorite. And that is on Jacob. That's not on Joseph whatsoever. Jacob is doing the very same thing that got him and Esau so messed up in chapters 30 and following, right? We see that kind of thing is taking place again, and we're going to see even more similarities of the Jacob and Esau flap that's going to come into play here in this morning's text. But they're jealous, they're absolutely furious, and so that leads to the ditch scene in verses 12 through 28. Now, just big picture, they see him coming. Let's get rid of him, guys. Let's get rid of this dreamer. They see how they depersonalize him. They don't say our brother. They don't say Joseph. They said this dreamer. Let's see what becomes of his dreams now that we kill him. We're going to make sure that this doesn't take place. And in many ways, as you're approaching this passage, look at it as being like Cain and Abel part 2. It has a lot of the markers of Cain and Abel, that you have a favored son and less favored sons. And so they're going to be mad not at the son. I mean, they don't like him, but they're really mad at dad. And that's what this is really all about. We're upset at dad, and so we're going to take it out on dad. But before we get there, look at verses 15 through 17 are curious. They're just extremely curious, and in many ways, this kind of subtly shows us the sovereignty of God in the midst of this whole thing. Because Jacob sends Joseph to look for his brothers. He looks for them. Does he find them? No. And so he's looking around, he's wandering in the field. Verse 15, a man found him wandering in the fields, and the man asked him, what are you seeking? Now, whenever there's an unidentified person in the book of Genesis, in every other passage, an unidentified man is an angel. I'm not saying it is an angel here, but it's just kind of curious. He's wandering in the middle of nowhere, and Joseph says, where are my brothers? And he says, please tell me where they are pasturing. And the man says, they have gone away, for I heard them say, let us go to Dothan. Just so you get an idea of scale, Dothan is 14 miles away. They are 14 miles away from here, kid. You need to head over to Dothan. Hint, hint, hint. If this part of the passage doesn't take place, Joseph doesn't end up in a ditch, right? If this part doesn't take place, Joseph doesn't get sold into slavery. He doesn't rise to power, and his family dies from a famine. That's what happens in just because of verses 15 through 17. This is showing you the invisible hand of God's providence. That God is at work in these really small details. How many kinds of conversations like this do we have all the time? How many conversations do you have with people that you think are absolutely meaningless and pointless? Maybe even aggravating. Don't sell those conversations short. Everything matters because God is committed to bringing blessing into this world. And so he's going to do that through bad circumstances. God isn't going to send the world into some sort of blessing devoid of suffering, honestly. Because when you look at it, when you look at the way of Christ, the way of Christ was the way of suffering, and the way of the Christian is called to be the way of suffering. We are told in Philippians chapter 1 that has been given to you both to believe and to suffer for his sake. I believe that's Philippians chapter 1, verse 29. So this is part of the path that God has given us, that we do not get the stuff without a struggle. But God will always be with us. And God is always making things right. But the obstacle here is that the evil brothers have turned Joseph's dreams into a nightmare. That's what they've done. They've taken him, they've stripped him of his robe, they've thrown him into the ditch. Now, in verses 21 through 22, it would have been worse if Reuben hadn't interceded. Remember, Reuben's on the outs with Dad. He had marital relations with one of Dad's wives. You may not remember that. Reuben's on the outs. And so he's trying to find any way to get good with Dad again. Oh, saving the favored son's life, that will get me good with Dad, right? That's what he's saying to himself. And that all falls apart. He's stripped, he's thrown into a dry pit, and while Reuben is off somewhere, he's sold into slavery. But before we go from looking at the dreams to looking at the ditch to moving on to looking at the deception, I wanted to point out just how cold the brothers are in verse 25. As I was reading this, I hope that you heard this. But they strip him of his clothes. They throw him in the ditch. It doesn't have any water in it, the reason why he doesn't drown. But you know for sure their 17-year-old brother, if he hasn't broken his leg, he's banged up really bad, and he is screaming a blood-curdling scream, guys. That's going on right over there. You can hear brothers screaming. Verse 25, then they sat down to eat. Guys, that's next level messed up. I mean, this is the kind of stuff you see in violent movies. And looking up, they saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead. They sit down, they eat. Brothers screaming, oh, look, slave traders. Why do we have to deal with this? Let's just get rid of the problem altogether. And then we'll each have 2 silver coins each. We can share it. And he'll be out of our lives forever. But then there's another monumental obstacle that's going to take place in verses 29 through 36. And really verses 29 through 35. 36 is kind of like a cleanup verse. It's going to push you into chapter 38, and then you're going to say, what in the world, why are you talking about Judah now? But we'll talk about that next week. In this passage, what we see is the brothers, they make a plan to deceive their father in verses 31 through 33. So they've done the Cain and Abel thing. They've been violent toward their brother, throw him in the pit, sold him off into slavery, and then Reuben shows up and he's like, oh, great. Even now, I can't do anything right. But then as you see in verses 29 and following, really verses 31, it says, then they took Joseph's robe and slaughtered a goat and dipped the robe in blood. And they sent the robe of many colors to their father and said, this we have found. Please identify whether it is your son's robe or not. Not our brother, your son. You see how detached they're becoming from this. And you should have already seen that in the fact that they're able to sit down and eat and do commerce in the midst of hearing these blood-curdling screams coming from Joseph over in the pit over there. But here's the irony of it all. One, there's about 2 or 3 bits, but I think this is the one that's the most pungent. Jacob deceived Isaac with what? A goat. You remember his mom fixed counterfeit wild game, the kind his father likes to eat? And he goes off into exile, right? Now his favorite son is sent into exile, and his sons deceive him with a goat. Everything gets absolutely flipped. On the literary side, it's genius. On the emotional side, I just got goosebumps because it's some cold stuff that's going on here in this passage. This is what happens when these brothers try to address the supposed injustice that's taking place in their life. Dad's playing favorites again. And so let's do something about it. Why? Because they are envious. They are jealous. And just as surely as this passage should push you back towards Cain and Abel, this fact that you have these Jewish men who are jealous of someone, and so they commit injustice to send him away, should drive you, well, to Acts chapter 2. Turn with me there. Acts chapter 2. This is the first sermon that takes place during the church age in the wake of Pentecost. If you look around towards verse 36, let all the house of Israel therefore know for certain that God has made him, Jesus, both Lord and Christ, this Jesus whom you crucified. That is what the religious leaders did. They crucified him. They killed him. It was through injustice that we receive our justification. That is the horrible beauty of the gospel. Is that it's because Jesus was abandoned. It's because Jesus was oppressed. It's because of their jealousy and their envy driving them to that has actually brought about the rescue of my soul. This is the same thing that's going on in the life of Joseph, but obviously with Jesus, it has cosmic implications. With Joseph, it only has very heavy geopolitical ramifications. Just the entire Middle East. Entire Middle East is at stake here. But with Jesus, it's the whole universe. So it is just amazing the irony that takes place here, and within that deception is the place that Joseph's story transports me to the cross, and I realize that in a very real sense, I am no different from Joseph's brothers. Because why did Jesus die on the cross? Because of me. How does the old hymn go? Mine was the transgression, but thine the deadly pain. That's That's the truth that we see here at Calvary, that I am really no different than the religious leaders of Jesus' day. My heart is filled with envy, and I need God's mercy and healing. That's what this passage drives me to when I realize that when I put myself into the story, when I realize that God's story subsumes me and collects me, and it points back at me, and it says, every time that you've pointed your finger at the Sanhedrin, every time that you've pointed your finger at someone else saying that they have an envy problem, Bill, you have an envy problem that is just as bad, and that's what drove Jesus to Calvary. But the good news is that there's hope for people like me. First, that I realize that I have a problem. For the scriptures tell me that if anyone is in Christ, he is a new creation. The old is gone. Behold, all things have become new. As I'm able to face the fact of that, then God is able to come in to my situation and into my cold, dark heart, and he is able to make me new. And that's why communion is so important for us to take, is because it's reminding us that we're square with God. Not because we've been good, but because Jesus is good. Because Jesus is merciful, because God's mercy has come to us, because it's there that we acknowledge the injustice on our behalf, that we are all sinners. All have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. And the wages of sin is death. We're clear on that from Romans 3 and Romans chapter 6. And it's here that we receive assurance that God knows. We intended all those things that we've done. We intended it for evil. But guess what? God is doing something new. It's at the table that we taste the mercy of God's sovereign grace, and that we see that for those who love God, all things work together for good, for those who are called according to his purpose. And so on this morning, what we can do is we can come and we can look at this story, and we can see that, yes, this story, it points backwards to Abel, it points forwards to Jesus, and it points even past that. It points to us and our need of a Savior, of a sovereign God who will love us and who will bless us, who is so sovereign that he will work through all of our dysfunction.